Welcome to the webinar, The Science of Teaching Reading, How Evidence-Based Literacy Practices Can Empower All Learners with Dr. Laura Tortorelli. Let's give folks a few minutes to hop onto the webinar before we begin. So those of you who have already joined may want to put your names and where you're from in the chat box for Dr. Tortorelli to see. All right. Maryland. Okay, Danielle from Oregon. Indiana, Marty, Texas, Georgia, South Dakota, some Canada, Ohio, Georgia, New Jersey, Kentucky.
Pakistan. Australia. Wow, this is quite a widespread group.
It is. Again, welcome to our webinar series, Spotlight on Structured Literacy. My name is Lama Farhan, and I serve on the IDA Georgia Board of Directors, and I'm co-chair of the webinar and conference committees. On behalf of the boards of both IDA and the Reading League Georgia, we are pleased to be offering this webinar series for the 4th year. IDA and the Reading League are committed to providing information on evidence-based practices to educators, parents, and advocates. In doing so, we hope all students will have access to structured literacy instruction. In this 5-part series, our speakers draw on the science of reading and the science of the teaching of reading. In tonight's webinar, Dr. Laura Tortorelli will discuss the recent national movement called the science of reading. She will describe key understandings from reading research about how children learn to read, including key ideas like the simple view of reading, orthographic mapping, lexical quality, and how children build reading proficiency over time. She will then explain that these findings can and can't teach us about the science of teaching reading in diverse classrooms. She will discuss common myths about how to apply the science of reading in elementary classrooms and highlight evidence-based instructional supports for these students to develop foundational recognition skills. She will highlight evidence-based practices in word recognition, vocabulary, fluency, and text comprehension, and the importance of text access for building young readers' skill and love of literacy. Before we begin, thank you to those who submitted questions when you registered for this webinar. As a reminder, if you have other questions, please put them in the chat box. The chat will be monitored this evening by Elizabeth Hogan, President of the Reading League Georgia. During the Q&A, our speaker will address as many of your questions as time allows. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Laura Tortorelli is an associate professor of elementary literacy in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. Dr. Tortorelli's research focuses on the text, technologies, and evidence-based practices for developing foundational reading and writing skills. She also teaches future teachers how to teach reading in Michigan State's #1 ranked elementary education program. Her work has been funded by the Institute for Education Sciences, the National Science Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund, and the International Literacy Association. Her current projects focus on supporting informational text reading and writing in 4th and 5th grade and integrating AI into early reading instruction. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Tortorelli.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me and for sending along your fantastic questions. I'll try to answer them as I go. And I've already been introduced, but I'm really excited today to share with you some of the findings from my research projects. I have a PhD in, I got my PhD in reading education from the University of Virginia, and I've now been at Michigan State University for 10 years. And as you heard, I've had a number of 100 projects where I've gotten to actually collect my own data. So I'm going going to be sharing research from other people and also research from some of my own projects. So we're going to start with a brief overview of some of the key theories that influence my work and the way I think about the science of reading. I could tell from your questions that you're all very familiar with the science of reading, and I'm sure that this webinar series is a big part of that. So it's going to be a brief overview of some of the basics and how I think about these concepts, so that we can think about those things get on the same page. And then I'm going to talk about some myths and some problems if an application of science of reading practices and principles that I run into in my work. And then I'm going to highlight a couple of key findings that have arisen from my research projects that highlight key practices that I think can be really beneficial if they become more widespread. So I'm going to start with the science of reading. Occasionally I will ask you to chime in the chat. So be ready to do that. Thank you for introducing yourselves there. So this is the ILA's definition of the science of reading, which is an accumulation of investigation and evidence about how humans learn to read and how reading should be taught. And we've been talking about the science of reading nationally now for at least 5 years. I think the first op-ed in the New York Times about teaching reading the wrong way was actually in 2018 from Emily Hanford. So we've been having a national conversation about improving reading instruction for 5 to 7 years now, including the whole COVID slump and online instruction. And I think there's been a lot of pushback and there's been a lot of misunderstandings. And a lot of it comes from conflating these two things: evidence about how humans learn to read and evidence about how reading should be taught. So we're going to talk about those two different bodies of evidence today. When we think about evidence of how humans learn to read, this is the simple view of reading. This is probably the best researched model that's out there that describes what makes the components of reading comprehension, what makes a good reader. And that it's an equation that I'm sure you've seen before. It's all over social media, which basically posits that reading comprehension is the product of a reader's ability to decode the words on the page and their ability to understand those words once they've decoded them, understand the words and the phrases, and of course, all the content. So linguistic comprehension times decoding. And I show this because this is probably the pillar of the science of reading. And it's been researched across dozens of languages in hundreds of studies at this point. So it holds up really well. It's very solid evidence. But it's not evidence of how you should teach reading. It's evidence of how you can describe a reader's reading comprehension and what sort of needs they might have, right? It also importantly tells us that we need both development in decoding and linguistic comprehension if we're going to have successful comprehenders. So this is a great model for talking about reading ability. It's not a great instructional model. And so I've seen that this confusion sort of conflating things sometimes. I see people trying to say that we have to teach decoding first because it's first in the model. That's not really how this type of research works, right? It's about describing the world and the process of learning to read that happens inside the human brain. And there are a couple of other theories that really help me understand this process and influence the work that I do. One is orthographic mapping, linear areas theory. One is lexical quality hypothesis, which is Charles Perfetti's work. And then the theory of automaticity, which it goes all the way back to the 70s, but really helps me understand how children build their decoding ability over time. So when we're thinking about decoding and linguistic comprehension, most of my work is on that decoding side, not because it's more important or because it has to come first, because that's my area of focus. And so these are three theories that really help me think about what we're trying to do in the course of development over what we're hoping to see kids be able to do as they develop as readers from kindergarten and up. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Linnea Airey's work on orthographic mapping. I also love her phases, but I didn't have time to get everything into this presentation today. But the important thing about Linnea's theory of orthographic mapping is that kids need to learn phonics, absolutely, but they aren't using phonics to decode words every time they read them. They're using that phonics knowledge to orthographically map those words the first few times they encounter them in text, and then they are able to process all the letter sound correspondences very quickly every time they see the word from then on. So I think sometimes we get the idea that because kids need a lot of phonics instruction in the early grades, and because they use that phonics instruction to learn to read words, that they're always processing words in the same way. But Urey's theory really explains to us that kids need the process of applying that phonics knowledge to read and write new words. And that's the process that really solidifies those words in their memory and makes them accessible for automatic use. So kids don't just need to know that C can make the K sound in a general sense. They really need to make that specific. They need to understand that C makes the K sound at the beginning of the word cat, and that cat is made up of K, A, T, which is represented by C-A-T, not K-A-T or another combination of letters. In the word rock, they need to understand that C and K make up that K sound. And then even for irregular words, they go through this process of figuring out what letters represent what sounds, even if it doesn't align with what they would expect. And it's that process of mapping those words and committing them to memory that makes reading more fluid and automatic. Sometimes when we talk about the science of reading, though, the conversation stops there. But in fact, Perfetti's lexical quality hypothesis explains why decoding is so important and word recognition is so important. Because he describes how kids store words in memory, not just by how they're spelled and how they sound, which is the result of that orthographic mapping and sort of gluing that phonetic pronunciation to the spelling process that we were discussing, but that once those two things are connected, they can also be connected to everything that kids already know about that word. So if it's a word that's in their oral vocabulary, they're connecting the spelling and the pronunciation to everything they know about the word meanings. And that means that the word is going to be able to contribute to their comprehension of what they're reading. So they can think about whether rock means a stone or a back and forth motion or a type of music. And they can also start to recognize the word across different forms, like the plural form or the verb form, or as part of compound words. And so decoding itself and learning these words and storing them in memory is about building up their lexical quality, not for all of the different components of the words, including meaning, not just the spelling and the pronunciations. And then finally, the theory of automaticity is something that's really important to me, which it describes how this develops over time. Basically, when kids first start to read, every time they encounter a new word in text, they have to use that phonics knowledge to do their orthographic mapping, right? So they have to slow down and figure out what letters, what sounds each letters are making, which each letter or letter pattern is making in the word, and figure out what the word is, match it to a word that they know in their oral language, and then move on. And so when kids first start reading, this is very laborious. And it's part of the reason that certain curriculum have come up with these like workarounds where kids can look at the picture and guess and that kind of thing. But in fact, they need to go through this process, because by going through this process thousands and thousands of times with all the words they encounter in text, this process of word recognition becomes more automatic. So for a little kid, it's very slow. They have to stop, figure out the word, go on to the next word, figure out the word. By the time they get to the end of the page, they've almost forgotten what they started. But over time, as they've orthographically mapped more words, built up that lexical quality, and committed them to memory, they are able to stop switching those attentional resources back and forth between decoding and comprehension, and recognize words without putting all of that effort in, so that more attentional resources are devoted to understanding what they're reading. And this is really what I see as the goal of beginning and elementary reading instruction, is to get kids who can read with most of their attentional resources focused on what they are reading and learning, so that they can get lost in a book, so that, they can curl up on a couch and enjoy things, or they can learn new things about the world. And this theory of automaticity really describes how we get kids to that point. It's through really high quality word recognition that allows them to build that automaticity in the early grades. So all my work is about getting kids to this point. And some of the reasons that I think we run into misunderstandings is that These are all descriptive studies. Every theory that I just provided for you, it's been tested, but often it's been tested in sort of in like laboratory situations. You'll notice that a lot of these like key studies of the science of reading by some of the pillars of our field are in journals of neuroscience, cognitive psychology, psychological bulletin. So these are not educational studies for the most part. These are cognitive psychology. And you'll notice that when these same authors then try to write about what to teach, like how to use this information to teach reading, you'll notice that their titles change quite a bit. They say things like, how should reading be taught? And lost in translation, challenges, and connecting the reading science and educational practice, and pragmatic challenges for bridging education and neuroscience. So I think sometimes there's this idea that we know what to do, there's tons of research, we should just do it. But that's not exactly true because the science of teaching reading, how reading should be taught, is a different field. It's educational research that needs to happen in classroom contexts, which is really social science research, which is quite different. And that's what I do. But it's very challenging. That doesn't mean that we don't know what works. One of the questions that you submitted was about evidence-based practices. And we do actually have quite a bit of knowledge at this point about what works as far as, and those are studies of evidence-based practices. So studies that look at children in real educational settings, for example, intervention studies or classroom studies, try different things and then measure the outcomes and see if children improve their reading skills after participating in a particular instructional practice. So one of the sources of research that I'm going to be sending you to a lot are the IES practice guides, which sort of collect that information. There's also What Works Clearinghouse, which collects information about different reading interventions as well. So we have a lot of evidence about this sort of thing, but it's not necessarily something that's ready to grab and go, right? It's not necessarily stuff that has been researched. It's still quite a few steps away from something that's ready to be picked up and used in a classroom. And the curricular products that are out there have varying degrees of taking up these different evidence-based practices. So I think that's where the gap is and why we're still talking about this 7 years later. It's not as simple as just being like, well, obviously we need to teach phonics. There's actually quite a bit that has to go into getting kids from that early beginning reading stage to that automatic stage. And what we know from research is absolutely helpful and relevant, but not all is immediately applicable in the classroom. So with that being said, that's sort of the background for why I think there are myths still circulating about the science of reading. I actually had to quit social media because there were so many arguments about the science of reading and I couldn't actually absorb it in my off time. So I want to talk about some of those myths that come up when I go to schools and try to work with teachers and in supporting some of the practices I'm going to discuss later. And you can, in the chat, I'd love for you to respond to say if you've heard any of these things. Have you ever heard teachers or parents, either one, say that they don't want to teach science of reading because it's boring and it makes kids hate reading? Or that they don't want to teach science reading because it's all phonics and only kids who are like, it's only relevant to kindergarten and first grade or kids who are struggling. Like most kids, I teach third grade, so I don't need to know about this. Or I teach fourth grade, I don't need to know about this. Or that teaching aligned with the science of reading is only appropriate for English speaking students. I have all these multilingual learners. This isn't relevant to me. So in the chat, indicate if you've heard any or all of these from people that you work with. Heard them all. Okay, yes. Mhm. Okay, good. I'm not the only one. Okay, good. So these are some of the concerns that people bring up to me when I'm trying to help them improve their instruction. So I'm going to explain a little bit about why these aren't true and and the evidence-based practices that are effective in these and the evidence that refutes these. So first of all, teaching aligned with the science of reading makes students hate reading. This is not true. This comes from a fear of explicit or direct instruction. Everything in our body of research about the science of reading studies explicit practices. So things that teachers are doing in purposeful ways to teach strategies, either phonics or other comprehension strategies to students, because that's how we can study it, right? Teachers do something intentional and we study the results. So teachers tell and what we have found is that there's quite a bit of evidence supporting explicit or direct instruction, specifically in phonics instruction, but also in other types of reading instruction as well, that this is an effective way to teach children how to read. Some teachers don't feel comfortable with this or feel that it's boring or feel that it's disempowering or they associate it with only doing worksheets or things like that. And so that's where this concern comes from. But the fact is, we know that students, the research says that we know that students start school motivated to read. If you ask a kindergartner what they want to do when they get to school, they say they're going to learn to read and they're really excited about it. And at that point, at the beginning of kindergarten, there's no correlation between how many literacy skills they have and how much they like reading. Some kids love it, some kids don't, but it's not related to how skilled they are at reading or beginning reading or early literacy skills. But as time goes on, every grade level, those two things become more tightly correlated. So that by the time kids are at the end of elementary school or in middle school, how much they like reading is directly related to how good they are at reading. And there's been longitudinal studies that have actually tried to show what comes first, right? Is it that they don't like reading, so they don't do it, so they don't get good at it, or is that they have trouble with it, so they find it frustrating? And so to illustrate, let's do a little exercise and you can decide which one you think comes first. Here is my first teaching job was in Japan. This is a Japanese syllabary called katakana. So I've taken an informational text that a third grader might need to read and just replaced some of the harder words with katakana. So go ahead and take a look, take a read on this. Take a minute to read this and see how it goes. Feel free to share any thoughts in the chat about how this feels. All right. So once you've read this, let's go to the next page. Do you want to how does this feel? Do you want to keep going and reading like this? Is this an enjoyable thing? It's just so much text. It just feels like it's going on forever. Yeah. Feel free to put any comments. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So the experience that you're having here is of a kid who can read a lot of words, right? Like you're not missing all the words, but but you're constantly getting stuck on some of these longer words. There's constantly a word that you have to stop and try to figure out what it is. And because I just showed you the katakana very briefly, and it's not something that you know very well, it's not useful to you. That's not a resource you have available to figure out the new words. So you're just guessing, right? And you're not able to comprehend what you're reading very well. It's slow, it's frustrating, and it's not very motivating. You don't feel like a good reader and you don't want to do it more. So what the longitudinal research shows is that motivation definitely can impact how often kids read, and that, of course, in turn impacts their achievement. But it really starts with their achievement. If they're having a lot of difficulty reading, it's not motivating. They don't want to do it, and they'll do it less. And they sort of get into what Miyamoto calls a vicious cycle, where they're not going to improve because it's so demotivating. But it really starts with this achievement. It starts with the experience they have with the words on the page and whether or not they have the tools to make sense of what they're reading. I'm going to pull from the NAEP data a couple of times during this presentation. Everyone else talks about how we know a third of kids are reading below basic and only a third of kids are reading proficiently. But another thing that they also ask kids about is whether or not they believe they can read and explain something. And what you find is that that breakdown is very, very similar to the achievement levels. Only 36%, about a third of kids say they definitely can read and explain something. And about a third say maybe. And then another third say maybe, or about a third say they probably can. I'm sorry. And then about a third say maybe, probably can't, definitely can't. So sometimes, so kids who are having trouble reading know that they're having trouble reading. It's not motivating and it does get in the way. So those two things are related. And teaching kids the skills they need to read the text in front of them is motivating and will help build that long-term reading motivation that we really want. So we don't have to worry about a trade-off between teaching aligned with the science of reading and motivation. So number two, teaching aligned with science of reading is mostly about phonics, and it's mostly appropriate for beginning or struggling readers. Now, several of you submitted questions about older readers, and I was super excited about that because I actually was somebody who started doing this. When I started studying at the University of Virginia, I wanted to learn about phonics and spelling for very beginning readers. And this is what people picture when they picture the science of reading, right? Sounding out CVC words, figuring out how to use those letter sound correspondences, the very beginning process that gets kids started with that orthographic mapping. And that's what I studied for the first 7 years of my career or so before COVID happened. And then post-COVID, I was getting all of these teachers coming to me and saying, well, now I have all these kids who like missed kindergarten, missed first grade. You know, they did first grade and second grade online. Like they have these gaps. They know a lot of things, but they have these gaps and I don't know how to support them. And so at this point, my research shifted and I started working in fourth and fifth grade. And actually, in my bio, it mentioned my fourth and fifth grade project. It's now actually expanded all the way through ninth grade. And so I've been really digging deep into figuring out the best ways to support older students and what they need. And basically what happens is that kids can get off to a really good start. They can master those early phonics, that early phonics knowledge and the process for orthographic mapping, but they actually have to keep growing over time to keep up with the demands of texts. Research shows us that the kids encounter 20,000 new words in texts, in grade level texts every year in school. And 90% of those new words, first grade and up, are multisyllabic, and 60 to 80% of them are derived from other words. That means they are longer, they are different forms of basic words that kids may have already learned. So that's pretty complex, and it gets complex very quickly. And these new words often carry the meaning of texts. If you think back to our text example, how many of you that we were just reading with all the words replaced, a bunch of the words replaced with katakana, how many of you figured out what the text was about? Did anybody figure it out? Yes, it was about hurricanes. Very good. But you needed those words, you need those big words to actually understand what a hurricane is and how it works and where it is, and that kind of thing. So it becomes a real obstacle to comprehension if you're still having difficulty with simple words, and it's also an obstacle to comprehension if you're having difficulty with longer words. And the two skill sets don't necessarily follow one another. Kids who can read bat and ball in first and second grade, they have to keep reading and keep getting support and instruction to then learn how to read two-syllable words. And then it's another step up again to read more complex, morphologically challenging words that show up in academic content. So in order to really prepare them for the work they need to do in science and social studies, a lot of my work focuses on informational texts. They have to make quite large strides in their word reading. And we're very focused on this first step. And there's quite a bit less focus on the second step, although many curricula do have some good syllable types and that kind of thing instruction. But we rarely, if ever, really talk about how to support kids in getting to this third step. And what I'm finding in my research is that in fourth grade and up, these are the types of words that are really causing kids difficulty, both with their word recognition and their fluency and their comprehension. So as an example, here's one very short page from a informational text that kids might read when they're in, second grade or the very beginning of third grade. What kinds of challenging words do they have to read in this? You can put them in the chat. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep, Voyager, Jupiter. hydrogen, helium, spacecraft Voyager. So you can imagine a kid who's a decent reader, who can read all of those single syllable words, um, having to spend quite a lot of time on word recognition in this text. There are proper nouns that are from Greek and Roman mythology. There are social studies history terms like Romans. There's compound words like spacecraft. There's ignited with that ed suffix. There's mostly with the ly suffix. There's Voyager, which is both a proper noun and has the er suffix. There's hydrogen, helium, which are content area science words. So you have quite a few words that it can cause you difficulty, even if you're a pretty decent reader going into this text. And going back to the NAEP data, what we find is that kids who are below basic or reading below basic or at the basic level in fourth grade are really still having quite a few difficulties with word recognition. Basically, they don't read as fast as kids who are proficient, and they don't read with as much accuracy. They have more mistakes, and they slow down when they're reading. They get caught up they slow down when they're reading even at the word level, and they can't decode new words as well. So basically, when we're looking behind these like achievement levels, what we see is consistent and persistent difficulties recognizing these longer words. And there's also quite a bit of research about what students do if they don't have good instruction on attacking these longer words. They tend to skip them. They tend to pronounce the first few sounds and then guess the rest, give one plausible pronunciation and then give up, leave off suffixes, try the wrong vowel sound. Have you seen any of these things? Do these sound familiar? Oh yeah, somebody else pointed out that all those words were content vocabulary. Absolutely. Um, yeah, here's some examples of the kinds of things that kids tend to do. And you can see how these are word reading errors, but they're not just word reading errors, right? They're word reading errors that are going to interfere with kids' ability to understand what they're reading. Oh dear, I'm going too slow. I need to move along faster. And so what we find is, and there's quite a bit of research that shows if kids don't get past this level of word reading error, if they're not able to recognize new words and complex words, they aren't going to be able to have their comprehension growth in middle school and high school stagnates. They aren't going to be able to read the new things that they need to read in those grades, and they're not going to be able to make the progress they need to make. So here are a couple of resources that I recommend for supporting kids who are older in getting through this phase and developing the word recognition skills that they need to read those harder texts. I'll put the link, I'll send out the slides with the links so that you can access these. One is an IES practice guide and another is a paper by Devin Kearns and Victoria Whaley. And I also wanted to share some of the research from my Read Stop Write project. Read Stop Write is an intervention dedicated to supporting kids in reading informational texts in fourth grade through ninth grade. We started with fourth and fifth grade, and we actually ended up expanding it this year because, as somebody pointed out in the chat, kids who had that COVID year in kindergarten are now in middle school. And kids who had the first grade in COVID have been in middle school for a year. And so we're finding that the kids who missed different years of instruction are needing more support to read these challenging texts. And I wanted to share some of the research. I do want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'll go a little bit fast through this. But one of the things we did was we looked at our student population of students who are in that sort of bottom quartile of reading skills. So, and wanted to dig in and see what their word recognition needs were. And so we tested them using an assessment called the Multisyllabic Decoding Inventory by Sharon Walpole, reading 140 two-syllable words and non-words. And these are the easiest words and the hardest words. Does anybody notice what the hardest words have in common? Only 5% of these kids could read the word bugle, for example, whereas 99% of them could read mushroom. Mm-hmm. Any ideas what groups these hardest words together? What they have in common? Vocabulary. Yes, good job, Anne Marie. Yeah, so when we actually did an analysis to try to see what types of words were the hardest, we found that the only significant predictors of difficulty were open for syllables, obviously, trying to figure out what sound that is, and then words that were age of acquisition above 8.5. So age of acquisition is just a measurement of vocabulary difficulty that represents when a word is typically acquired in a kid's expressive vocabulary. So both words with that open first syllable are harder. And also words that are difficult vocabulary were harder. For the most part, kids could read 85% of the two-syllable words we gave them, but those two types of words were giving them trouble. And this is just another way of looking at the same data. You'll see the age of acquisition along here at the bottom and a scatter plot. You can see a clear decline in how many kids are getting a word based on how sophisticated it is as a vocabulary item. And the red dots represent words with open first syllables. And so basically what we find is that kids who aren't getting over that hump into being able to fluently read informational grade level texts in middle school and high school, it's not that they need basic phonics, actually. What they need is more high quality and more sophisticated word level instruction that integrates vocabulary into their multisyllabic decoding. And so this means they need a lot of work with morphemes. Morphemes are fantastic because they are both meaning units and decoding units. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. And any kind of instruction in using these to recognize new words is going to really help them with those higher level words and that sophisticated vocabulary, particularly these derivational suffixes, right? Derivational suffixes are suffixes that actually like change a word from one part of speech to the other. Those are particularly difficult and they show up very frequently in informational texts. And so in the Read Stop Write project, we looked at research in the IES practice guide that I shared and found that there's quite a bit of evidence about teaching kids a strategy for breaking apart words when they come across them in text. There's obviously tons of evidence for teaching morphology and syllable types and that kind of thing. But what we found was lacking in a lot of curricula that our partner schools were using was any sort of application, any sort of bridge from that instruction to teaching kids how to use that information when they encounter a hard word in text to get them to stop skipping those words. So we teach them this 4-step strategy for breaking apart those words. So for example, in the word rotation, we teach them to underline all the vowels and vowel teams in a word. And then we integrate that with the morphology knowledge that they have. So circling the prefixes and suffixes. Something that I love about this is that IO is not a vowel team. If you don't know the suffix shun, you're not going to know that that's just one vowel sound with a schwa, and you're not going to know to pronounce the T as an SH either. We really need that morphological knowledge here. And then you divide it up into parts, say each word part, and then say the whole word and see if it sounds right. We'll talk about what happens if it doesn't sound right in a minute. And we teach them to be flexible. They can go syllable by syllable if that's the stage that they're at, or once they start to recognize these spelling changes with derivational suffixes, they can think about what the base word is and how and pronounce and have that as a unit for decoding as well. And we give them a little cheat sheet with these processes. So basically what we find is that kids still need a lot of support with things like this, even kids who are not, kids who are like intervention kids or kids who are behind in any particular way. And they need more of this support than ever before in 4th grade and up because because of those COVID gaps and other things. So let's get back to our 3rd myth here, which is that teaching aligned with the science of reading is only appropriate for English-speaking students. I often hear this from teachers who have lots of multilingual learners. They say this is too hard for them. And then I also hear from people who, that this research is kind of old. It was probably done with all white monolingual students. We don't know that it actually applies. If we go back to our NAEP data, we see that there's reason for concern here, right? That kids have shown quite a bit of decline in their NAEP scores over the past 5 years, but kids who are identified as English learners in this testing system have shown even bigger declines. And so we do know we need to pay attention to this population and make sure what we're doing is evidence-based for them. And if you look at the guys who did a lot of the foundational science of reading research, they don't look like, they're old white guys, right? But that doesn't mean that they weren't concerned about this. In fact, one of the very first studies of the simple view of reading did focus on English, Spanish bilingual children in first and fourth grade. And there's actually just been tons and tons of research since. So it's not true that we don't know what works. Here are two resources that I highly, highly recommend. One is an IES practice guide, and one is a review of reviews. So when there's enough evidence on a particular topic, you can write a meta-analysis or a systematic review that kind of summarizes all the research. And Jonathan Kittle and his colleagues here actually wrote a review of all the reviews about the science of reading for multilingual learners. And this is an open access paper that's really readable and I highly recommend. But just to summarize, basically what we know is that kids who are bilingual actually have or multilingual actually have an advantage in many language learning opportunities. And they can typically have stronger phonemic awareness than multilingual students because they have to pay attention to more language systems and have been sensitized to those. They typically have equal word reading abilities once they have gotten instruction, and they have equivalent or larger oral vocabularies if you consider all of their language knowledge across their languages. And they experience dyslexia and other reading disabilities, just like anybody else, but it's not because they're multilingual, right? Like they can have, that you can be a multilingual student who is dyslexic, and you can't, and you can, but it's not, the two things are different, are different challenges. So they typically have reading difficulties or disabilities at the same rate as other kids. So it's not necessarily one or the other. And bilingual facilitation theory basically tells us why this bilingual advantage exists. Basically, when kids are learning only one language, everything they know about language is based on that one sample, right? That language. But if they have two languages, then they can learn much more about how languages work and be much more flexible in applying that knowledge. And so what we know, and this is a very, very brief summary of the Kittle article. I hope you'll all go and take a look at it. But basically what we know is that the language skills that children develop in their first language absolutely predict their reading abilities in English. And so especially any sort of phonics or phonemic awareness or decoding skill that they've developed in another language will support them and help transfer to their English reading comprehension. Also their first language vocabulary, and also any reading comprehension if they've gotten that far in their first language will predict their English reading comprehension. So many of these skills do transfer across languages. My advisor at UVA, Marcia Invernizzi, used to say, you only learn to read once. And then because learning to read is a psychological process of understanding that you're transferring print into ideas. And that big watershed moment only happens once. And then you learn other languages and you do learn to read in those languages, but the big watershed event only happens once. But even for children who didn't learn to read in their first language, all of these early language skills, particularly phonemic awareness and phonics, do transfer to the other language. And in the review, you'll also see what kinds of practices help facilitate this transfer. For phonological and phonemic awareness, we know that direct instruction works really well, just like it does for English monolingual students. And it's true whether they receive that direct instruction in their first language or in English. Both things support their phonological and phonemic awareness in English. Something that's a little bit different is that English auditory discrimination training really helps. So really digging in and helping them understand the differences between the sounds in English. So for example, hearing the difference between the L and the R sound for students who speak Japanese, because those are not two, they only have one sound in Japanese. They don't have both of those sounds. So that sort of thing can be really helpful. And then any sort of collaborative group work. We often think of science of reading or phonics or phonemic awareness instruction as being like one, call and response or whole group where everybody's just kind of sitting and responding to the teacher, but actually allowing kids to talk to each other about the words and working together to figure things out is very beneficial for multilingual learners. Same thing with phonics and decoding. Explicit and systematic phonics works. It's good for their phonics and decoding, whether they're, whether they've received that in their first language or in English. And then helping them use their first language and supporting that cross-linguistic transfer is really beneficial as well as this collaborative group work. So when we talk about strategic use, we're talking about not reteaching them things that they already know, but building on those commonalities. So, for example, cognates, helping them think about words that they already know in their oral vocabularies and how that can help them figure out new words in English. And also thinking about the letters and sounds that are shared between the two languages and not reteaching things that might be shared. But also really helping them see the differences and being explicit about the differences or about the confusions that may arise when you're learning two different language systems at the same time. So for example, pointing out, that there are way more vowel sounds in English than in Spanish, for example, and helping them actually distinguish between some of those vowel sounds that may all sound the same to them. That kind of thing can be really helpful, and being really explicit and supportive about it is better than pretending it's not happening. And then with vocabulary, there's a lot of very effective strategies, but some of them are were really interesting to me. One is English phonics instruction helps build English vocabulary, helping kids integrate word meanings and their word reading helps them build that vocabulary because then they're able to apply that in texts. Reading informational texts is also very beneficial, as are word learning strategies that sort of combine all the different things we've been talking about. So morphemes, cognates, and context clues, putting all those together to help learn new words from texts is very supportive for multilingual learners. And so back to my project, we did 2 years of research developing and testing this program. And then we switched to a different school district for the last year that had many, many multilingual learners in it. And so we had to go pretty deep in the research and make sure that everything that we were doing was aligned with what was best for that population to make sure that it would work. And basically, we have this strategy for breaking apart words that I already showed you. And there are other strategies out there that are similar, like I know some of you probably use the Eshlov strategy or the BEST strategy. Those are fine too. But basically, a strategy for breaking apart words. And then we immediately follow it with strategies for learning vocabulary. Because when you're reading informational text, you're encountering new words that you haven't seen before. And so sometimes those are new vocabulary words that you need to learn. And so if it's a new word that you don't recognize, we provide these strategies and teach them to use these strategies to try to figure out what it means. And that includes using the word parts, thinking about the meaningful roots, prefixes, and suffixes that might appear in the word, and then combining it with the context and teaching them to use context clues when those are helpful. Sometimes they're not that helpful, but between those two things, and also thinking about cognates, words in other languages that look or sound the same, we can often find that kids can get to the meaning of the word without resorting to asking the teacher or going to a dictionary. And so in the case of the word rotation, in this case, we help kids think about that base word and the suffix. So, it means like the state of rotating. So sometimes for some kids that will help figure out what it is. But for some kids, they can go to the Spanish cognate, rotación. And then for some kids, combining that with the context clue, the passage of the day and night is caused by the rotation of the earth, really helps solidify it and put it all together and help identify the context appropriate meaning. So basically, somebody asked about evidence-based practices versus evidence-based interventions or programs. And basically, the difference is there are lots of evidence-based practices. Sometimes we say we don't have enough research about how to teach reading, and that's not true. We have tons of research on how humans learn to read and tons of research on how to teach reading. But sometimes these practices are all listed out in a very long document, like these IES practice guides, right? So this IES practice guide that I've recommended for you includes recommendations around decoding skills, like the ones I was sharing with you. It also includes fluency building, comprehension building practices, and opportunities to help kids use what they call stretch texts, which just means challenging texts that they wouldn't be able to read independently in school. And so this is a lovely practice guide, but it's very difficult for teachers and everything in it is evidence-based, right? We know that if you do these things, it will help students, but it's not necessarily easy to put together or integrate into your day. And so what evidence-based programs or interventions try to do is take what we know about how humans learn to read and what we know about evidence-based practices and put them together in a usable package for teachers. So my intervention or program supporting informational text reading is called Read, Stop, Write. It's freely available. I'll share the link with you if you want to try it. But basically, this is sort of the operationalization of those practices from the practice guide, where we focus on helping kids read multisyllabic words, figure out what they mean, you read an informational text that has those words, and then use comprehension strategies and fluency strategies to make sense of it, and then write in response to the reading. So they use summarization, text structure, and then they organize and plan to write, and then write about the topic. So basically, we take a bunch of evidence-based practices and put them together in one package, and then we test that. We test whether the package works and see if it improves kids' skills and abilities. And so far we haven't analyzed all the third year data yet, but so far we have found that we're supporting kids' comprehension and word recognition in this one big package. So that's sort of the difference. You can do the individual strategies and adapt them yourself, or you can get an intervention that's actually, or curriculum that's actually been tested as a package, as a program on its own. So I think I'm out of time, but here's some more information. Here's some of the research studies that I've been citing that have come out of this work. And here is the Read Stop Write website if you're interested in more. There's all the lesson plans and slide decks and everything else that you need are freely available there if you're interested in trying this out. We've tested it in grades 4 through 8, but we do have lesson plans available that you can use in 9th grade as well, because I know some people were interested in high school. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to question and answer.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Tortorelli. That was awesome. I always have to shift to the questions from my own personal notes that I was taking. And sometimes I do slip in my own personal questions that I had, but this was awesome. And I'm excited to go look at some of these resources for myself. I was thinking, and I love how much we always have so many questions about multilingual learners. And I really like the attention you paid to that tonight. So you really answered a lot of those questions that we had. I did want to ask a little bit, and I feel like this is kind of I don't even know that it's a hot button topic, but as far as our teachers every day really trying to incorporate, maybe because of legislation or new curriculum, the science of reading in their classrooms. I have two questions, and that came from our attendees. Do you recommend this happen whole group? What would your tier 1 structure for this be? Is this a whole group thing and then your kids that need more in small group, or does everyone do better in small group? What have you seen in your research?
This is such a good question. So I think and I'm constantly asked about this. I'm like, well, what should tier 1 be and what should be the intervention? And my feeling is that they should be very similar, right? Like everybody should get exposure in tier 1 to to morphology, to the strategies for decoding long words, to challenging informational texts. But some kids are going to need more support and more repetition in those strategies. And some kids are going to be able to do this a little bit more independently very quickly. I don't know if you're familiar with I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Bookworms curriculum and the differentiated reading instruction, small group intervention that's part of that. This was originally something we developed. I developed this with Dr. John Strong, is actually the PI on the project and the leader. You'll see him on the website if you go. And he was a student of Sharon Walpole's, and he designed this to work with the DRI project to be something that kids who were in those top two stair steps could do in their small groups. But what we found was there were so many kids who could benefit from it that we actually ended up running it whole group for a lot of classes. So it really depends on the composition of your class. Like, are some kids ready to just read these challenging informational texts by themselves? Probably, but it depends on how many kids in your class need this kind of support? So we've tested it whole group, but it was originally designed to be used small group. And a lot of strategies are like that, right? Like you want everybody in the class to have exposure to the strategy, but some kids are going to pick it up really quick and not need as much support. And some kids will benefit from additional support and guidance with you. And with multilingual learners, they always benefit from a chance to be in a small group where they get to talk. Sometimes with whole group work, they don't get as much time to talk. And talking to each other about the work they're doing is one of the most powerful things that they can do. So I think any curriculum or strategy that you're using is similar, right? Everyone needs to get exposure to it, but kids will need different levels of practice. And so you can, most things can be flexibly used in both contexts. It just depends.
Yeah. That's just so interesting to think about because I actually love the visual of the stair steps for that.
Yeah.
Thinking about where your kids fall, it's nice to have a visual and then what you're working towards for the group here. And then I think teachers often say, like you said, the myth of our higher readers, kids that can already do all this, they don't need this instruction, but we know that that's not true. And so we know we can push them further. And I love that visual just because it's a good way to think about the kids in your class.
Well, and I think the same thing about the kids who need extra help. There's often this idea that they can't do certain things and we shouldn't, they should have to master this before they get exposed to challenging informational texts. And what we really tried to do was build in enough supports so that everybody could get exposure and have success reading those challenging informational texts, even if they wouldn't be able to do it independently. Sometimes we really want kids to be able to read things independently, which is great, but they can do that on their own. And in school, they can also be pushed to read harder texts. And that's one of the recommendations in the practice guide is that kids get exposure to harder texts and the supports they need to be successful with them.
All right. I'm checking out the chat to see if people
Yeah.
are asking new things. We always get the questions, and I actually feel like you addressed this more so than sometimes happens, but we always get the questions about our middle school and high school kids that are still struggling, that maybe it is a true learning disability. Maybe it is just that they haven't been taught explicitly and with structured literacy or using the signs.
Absolutely. It's very hard to tell at that point.
Right, exactly. So regardless of what it is, and trying to tease that out, what are your kind of favorite programs or where would you direct teachers of those kids? Because they don't necessarily have that time built out in their middle and high school curriculum and day.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, I keep talking about my program because that's just what I've been working on. I'm not saying this is the only program that does it. There are other programs
I'm
out there.
excited to check it out.
Sharon Walpole, by the way, has a new middle school book that is coming out. I actually got to read it in early stage, in the preview stage, and so that's coming out. And so she has a differentiated reading instruction program for middle school that's going to be great when it hits the shelves. But basically, what the research says and what we tried to do in Read Stop Write was basically provide multi-component support, not just make everybody do, multisyllabic word decoding, or just fluency practice, but really trying to integrate all of those things so that they're working on comprehending an interesting text while doing multisyllabic decoding and fluency practice. So basically that there's a clear purpose to the reading that they're doing, so that doesn't feel like, I'm bad at reading and that's why they're making me read 100 words on a piece of paper, that kind of thing. And so basically kids who need foundational skills practice in those older grades benefit from integrating that into meaningful reading experiences. And so what we've been trying to do is create this informational text intervention that can support those skills while reading, interesting texts. And teachers have used it in both ELA classrooms to alternate with their narrative units, and then also in social studies and science classrooms because they align with those, those are the texts that we're reading. So basically that the research indicates that we want to integrate as much as possible and make it a meaningful experience.
Yeah, and I feel like we did get a question, and I think you did a great job of answering this on all levels, and so I just want us to say it again. So the question was, do you address comprehension separately from decoding and encoding instruction? And I feel like what we're hearing is that no, right? We're addressing all of that.
Yeah, for younger kids, yes, sometimes the books they're reading aren't challenging enough to like get into those deep conversations about the books that support comprehension. So sometimes, yes, you'll have read alouds and you'll have decoding practice, and that's okay. But by the time they're hitting these harder books in third, fourth, and fifth grade, you really want to be integrating the two, and work and comprehending. Because if they don't understand the words, they're not going to comprehend the text, right? And if they don't comprehend and understand the text, they're not going to be interested in the words. And so, really working on those two things together as much as possible.
Yeah. Okay. Lastly, this will have to wrap us up, but this is also a little bit of a personal question, but a lot of people ask questions around this. Just thinking about teacher training, right? So many of us, myself included, did not receive this in our undergraduate teacher prep programs or our masters, or sometimes even further teacher prep programs as far as the science of reading. As far as teacher training, do you feel like teachers can kind of find good curriculum that they can rely on, or do we really need to be if a school's spending money, should we be spending money on actually training teachers as practitioners and then
This
giving
is
them
such,
the resources, or do we buy curriculum for them to try to figure out?
this is such a good question, and I actually wrote a whole like lit review trying to answer this question at one point, like as a teacher now. Yeah, and so but basically it's both. Teachers need to know, they need the background knowledge. They absolutely need this. They need to understand the science of reading and how and reading development and all of that stuff. Like we can't do it. AI can't teach reading like by itself. Like teachers need to understand this at a really deep level. And there's different types of knowledge that they can develop. And some of it's technical, but some of it's practical. Like just the experience of teaching kids to read over time makes you better at that. And so they need that deep knowledge, but they also, and if they have it, they could, make up their own lessons every day. But I believe they should not have to.
Right.
I believe that it's not necessarily, I believe that a good curriculum is very helpful, especially for new teachers who are still developing that practical knowledge. And also that it's a labor issue, right? Like teachers shouldn't have to develop their own curriculum. They're only being paid to do one job. And so I feel that both for teachers' sanity and work-life balance, and for supporting that we should give them materials that align with what their knowledge. And I believe that what the research shows is that teaching with high quality materials over time deepens your knowledge and makes you more expert. And so like it's kind of a both thing. We like teachers absolutely need this. We can't just hand them a curriculum because you have to adapt it to your kids and you have to understand what if they're having trouble, why, and that kind of thing. But they also deserve a really good curriculum. So that's how I feel.
Yeah. And I feel like in Georgia, we've done a lot in the last couple of years to get that part right. But I'm only coming from that perspective. And we have so many participants from all over. And I know they might be advocating in their states for those high quality instructional materials and, for teacher training as well. And I just think it's important, that we talk about both and, we need them. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I'm going to move away from the chat. It pains me, but I think we covered a lot. And I just want to thank everyone who attended tonight, but especially for your insightful presentation, Dr. Tortorelli. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And if you did attend and you have friends or colleagues who missed tonight's webinar, please let them know that they will receive a link to the webinar, or you could share yours, as well as Dr. Tortorelli's slides, which will be awesome because I'm awaiting those right now.
Yeah, and I'll have the links to all the resources in there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All registrants will also have the opportunity to fill out a check for knowledge and to get their certificate of attendance. So after you view it either tonight live or the recorded version, the form will be sent out early next week for that knowledge check. And the registrants will have approximately 1 week to submit that form. Once you fill out the form, you will receive your certificate of attendance the day after the deadline for submission. So on behalf of the boards of the IDA Georgia and the Reading League Georgia, we so appreciate you attending tonight. We're a little sad to wrap up this series, but we're already planning our series, our structured literacy series for next year, for early 2026. I can't believe it. So we're excited to see you back then and be following us on social media to hear all about that. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you so much again, Dr. Tortorelli, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Have a great evening.
You too. Bye.